In the next unit of this course, our focus is going to shift towards extracting and processing data. And one critical element of that work is ensuring that the data is of a high quality. Now, to emphasize this point, to drive this point home, let me share one quick nerdy anecdote. This is the Mars Climate Orbiter. In December of 1998, NASA launched this probe into outer space with the express mission of searching for water on Mars, collecting data regarding Mars's atmospheric conditions. But just when the probe was about to enter Mars's orbit, NASA lost all contact with it. All we got was this single blurry image of the planet, and soon thereafter, the machine burned up in Mars's atmosphere. So what happened? What went wrong? As it turns out, an investigation was done later, and they determined that of all the software on this very expensive probe, one single bit of the software was programmed using the imperial system of measurement, like pounds, feet, and inches, whereas everything else was using the metric system. Now, these probes are not cheap. I think it was roughly $500 million to develop, launch, and operate this orbiter. So a pretty costly mistake arising from inconsistent data. In this lecture, we're going to explore other dimensions of what constitutes high-quality data, which is a prerequisite to high-quality information. Before talking about high-quality information, I want to be clear about the difference between what is meant by the term data versus information. They are two distinct concepts, and reasonable people might come to a different determination about where the line is. But I'd like to present a simple way of characterizing between the two. Let's start with data. Data refers to raw, unprocessed facts and figures. It could be numbers, text, dates, anything that can be recorded and stored. Data is often described as facts lacking context, and without that context, it lacks meaning. We can contrast this with information. Information denotes data that has been structured and processed, and the fundamental difference is this last point, whether it has been made useful to others. Keep in mind that as a data analyst, it is our job to process data to provide decision makers with useful information. Now that we can tease apart the difference between what is data and what is information, we can proceed to talk about what constitutes high-quality information. Here, I've assembled 10 dimensions that each describe a unique element of high-quality information. You want to be familiar with these because as we keep learning about the ETL process, it will be apparent that our goal is to process the data such that it is of a sufficient quality to be useful to decision makers. Let's go through each of these individually. First, and perhaps most obviously, it needs to be accurate or free from errors. If you've got inaccurate information, how are you supposed to make the best decisions? Next, data needs to be available or accessible to users. Data must be complete. It doesn't omit any needed data. We make sure that all the fields we need are included, and we make sure that any given field is non-empty, at least insofar as we could expect. Complete data is a prerequisite for complete information. Next, there's consistency, which refers to information being presented in the same format every time. This helps facilitate understanding. Data must also be current. Now we got to be careful. This is the first one with a time component. Information is current if it is up to date. It needs to reflect the most recent data available, as outdated data can mislead your analysis. Data should be objective. Ideally, you want an unbiased representation of the facts. To the extent that you can, you want to make decisions based on an objective measure of reality, not a human's perception, which can be subject to bias. Information needs to be relevant, meaning it pertains to the requested or relevant situation. Information should be timely. Now, again, I want to be careful here. Students often confuse what is meant by timely versus current. If information is timely, it means it is provided in time to be used in decision making. Data should be understandable, easily comprehended. Our job as analysts is not only to discover the insights, but we need to communicate them effectively and simply. Lastly, we've got verifiable. High-quality information can be checked and confirmed by others. It ought to be supported with proper documentation. This builds credibility and transparency.
when you can cite your data sources and demonstrate your work in preparing that information. Again, part of the motivation for looking at these is because nearly every single dimension listed here are things that we can influence during the ETL process. Relevant, objective, and current information implies that we have carefully selected our data sources. Being thoughtful in our transforming the data necessitates that we be accurate, or at a minimum have made our process verifiable. And to make our work useful to decision makers, we need our ETL process and analysis to be efficient so that the insights we produce are timely and understandable. Now, to help drive this point home, I've got a little exercise for you to do. Maybe grab a paper and pencil and try to fill in the blanks with me in this hypothetical scenario. We've got an accountant named John, and he is in charge of producing an accounts receivable aging report for his supervisor. And we can consider this report as information. He took some accounts receivables data, and he's now trying to help inform his boss and the sales team. They're trying to update the company's credit policy, and this information would likely be useful. The problem is, his report lacks several characteristics of high-quality information. So pause the video and try to identify which component is missing for any given phrase or sentence. At a minimum, just pause the video before I read each answer. Okay, so let's go through this. John, an accountant, was tasked with preparing an accounts receivable aging report for a supervisor. Unfortunately, the report he submitted was based on last quarter's data. Well, if this is outdated data, that means it is not current. Additionally, John made errors when making calculations with dates. Errors, that means the data is not accurate. And he failed to include several outstanding invoices. Failing to include relevant data would mean it's not complete. Moreover, the report was formatted differently than how it was prepared historically, making it not consistent, and in a way that was difficult to interpret, meaning it wasn't understandable. Furthermore, John did not provide sources or documentation to back up the figures. It's not verifiable. Lastly, John was unable to prepare the report before the sales managers met to update the company's credit policy. This wasn't timely information. So again, I hope you're familiar with all of those and can recognize how they apply, or in this case, were missing in a scenario. So 2 major takeaways from this video. First, you've got to know the difference between what is data and what is information, at least from a definitional standpoint. Different people will conclude on different definitions here, but the main distinction that I care about is this. Information reflects processed data that has now become useful. Information is no longer a set of raw facts. We've given it context, and it is now ready to facilitate decision making. And the better the information, the better the decisions we can make. You also need to know those 10 dimensions or characteristics of high quality information. Ask yourself whether you could define any of the terms we reviewed and if you can recognize them as applied within a given scenario.